The camera cuts to a packed studio. The air feels heavy, an unspoken tension like a storm waiting to break. Stephen Miller leans forward, his smirk sharp as glass. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he says, voice slick with condescension, "do you even understand what the Constitution says about borders?" A few chuckles ripple through the audience, nervous, uncertain. Jasmine Crockett doesn't move. She watches him the way a mountain watches lightning, calm, unmoved, inevitable. He mistakes her silence for surrender. "That's what I thought," he continues, his words slow, deliberate, dripping with superiority. "People like you, idealists, don't live in the real world. You live in feelings." His hand slices the air like a judge delivering a sentence. The moderator hesitates, sensing where this is headed. The camera pans back to Crockett, her hands folded, her voice low but firm. "The real world," she says softly, "the one where children are caged because of your policies, where families flee terror only to meet cruelty at our gates." Her tone doesn't rise, but every syllable cuts through the set like thunder. Miller shifts in his seat. The smirk falters just slightly. The audience leans forward. There's something magnetic about her calm, a power that doesn't need to shout. She continues, each word deliberate. "You talk about borders. I talk about people. You measure humanity by walls. I measure it by worth." The silence after those words stretches long enough to feel sacred. The audience erupts, not in chaos, but in a wave of relief, as if someone finally said what they've been screaming inside. Miller tries to recover, fumbling for his notes. "You're twisting facts," he snaps, but the energy has shifted. He's no longer the architect of the moment. He's the one trapped inside it.
Crockett turns toward him, her gaze steady. "Facts don't need twisting," she says. "They need witnesses." The room stills. 1,000 unspoken truths seem to hang in the air. Even the cameras feel alive, sensing history crystallizing in real time. And then, just as the moderator begins to speak, Crockett looks straight ahead, almost to the viewers at home, and adds quietly, "This isn't just a debate. It's a reckoning." The screen fades to black. What happens next will leave the entire country in disbelief. The morning after the debate, the clip has already ignited every corner of the internet. Millions watched the moment Jasmine Crockett turned a man known for his cruelty into a symbol of his own collapse. Hashtags bloom like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag truth wins. Hashtag dignity over division. But beyond the trending pages and viral edits lies the real battlefield. What that exchange represents about America itself. The debate wasn't just about immigration policy. It was about who gets to define patriotism, those who build walls or those who build bridges. Stephen Miller had walked onto that stage expecting another easy night, another chance to posture as the intellectual guardian of American identity. But Crockett wasn't there to play his game. She was there to dismantle it. She understood the risk. For every viewer who cheered her composure, there were others ready to twist her words, to brand her as emotional, ungrateful, too loud. It's a playbook she'd seen 100 times, the way strong women of color are framed as threats simply for refusing to bow. Yet that night, her restraint became her rebellion, her silence before her response. That heartbeat of calm wasn't hesitation, it was power. Commentators began dissecting the moment in real time. "Watch how she controls the space," one pundit said, replaying the clip. "He tries to dominate, she dismantles him with stillness." Another clip surfaced, Miller moments before the debate, laughing with staffers, rehearsing his lines like a prize fighter, confident of victory. Now, side-by-side edits show the reversal, the smirk dissolving into uncertainty, the predator turning prey. And underneath the spectacle, something deeper stirred. Crockett's words, "You measure humanity by walls, I measure it by worth," weren't just a rebuttal, they were a mirror. For every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, for every child who had watched a parent be dismissed for their accent, those words carried the weight of a nation's conscience. The backlash, of course, began almost instantly. Anonymous accounts flooded timelines with doctored clips, twisting her statement into sound bites stripped of meaning. Pundits on fringe networks called her divisive. Others questioned her temperament. But what they couldn't bury was the authenticity of the moment, the unfiltered truth of dignity standing up to cruelty. In the streets of Dallas, a mural began taking shape overnight. Jasmine Crockett, one hand raised, surrounded by silhouettes of families at the border. Underneath, spray painted in gold, worth, not walls. And yet, this was only the beginning, because for every viral clip, there's a history behind the headline. To understand why this clash carried such seismic weight, to understand why Miller's words were more than just rhetoric, you have to go back to the origins of the man who built his empire on fear and the woman who rose to confront it. Because before Crockett silenced him, Stephen Miller had spent years scripting America's silence. Long before the cameras, before the headlines and the White House speeches, Stephen Miller was already crafting a world built on fear. In high school, he wrote essays warning that multiculturalism was diluting America. Teachers remembered him as the kid who thrived on provocation, who relished the discomfort of others. He learned early that outrage was power and that cruelty, if dressed as conviction, could command attention. In college, that instinct sharpened into ideology. Surrounded by privilege, but obsessed with grievance, Miller studied the art of emotional manipulation. He devoured talk radio, learned the rhythm of indignation, the cadence of certainty. Every word he spoke was a weapon, not meant to persuade, but to dominate. He joined political clubs not to belong, but to disrupt. He discovered that if he spoke loudly enough, if he played the villain convincingly, people would listen, even those who hated him. When he entered politics, he carried that performance with him like armor. He wrote speeches that stripped empathy from policy, that turned human suffering into applause lines. For every child in a detention center, there was a press release spinning it as law and order. For every broken family, a phrase about national sovereignty. The cruelty wasn't collateral, it was the point. It was his language. But beneath that certainty was something smaller, pettier, a hunger for validation. Behind the polished grin and tight rhetoric lived a man desperate to be seen as the mind behind the movement. In every photo beside power, he saw proof of his own creation myth. Stephen Miller, the strategist who could weaponize fear itself. He believed he'd outsmarted empathy, that compassion was weakness, that outrage was a ladder. Each controversy made him stronger. Each protest made him famous. The more the world recoiled, the more he felt affirmed. If they're angry, he once told an aide, it means we're winning. But every ideology built on contempt eventually turns inward. Over time, the words he wielded began to define him. He stopped seeing faces in his policies, only symbols. Immigrants became abstractions, their stories erased. Even allies began to notice his eyes, cold and detached, like someone who had traded humanity for control. Behind closed doors, staff whispered about him, how his presence chilled a room, how he seemed to enjoy chaos. Yet no one challenged him outright. Fear had become his brand, and in politics, fear sells. Still, outside his carefully curated world, a new generation was rising, one that saw through his performance. They weren't cowed by his language, they were enraged by it. They spoke his name not with respect, but with defiance. And among them was a woman who embodied everything he feared: intelligence without apology, strength without cruelty, patriotism without exclusion. When Jasmine Crockett began gaining national attention, Miller took notice. He dismissed her as another emotional liberal. But the more she spoke, the more she disrupted the narrative he'd built. Her calm exposed his bluster. Her clarity revealed his manipulation. She represented the very thing he'd spent his career trying to erase, an America that included everyone. By the time their debate was announced, Miller saw it as an opportunity, one last stage to reassert control, to remind the country who shapes the story. What he didn't see was how much the world had changed since he first learned to weaponize fear. People were tired. They were watching differently now. They were ready for something else, truth spoken without trembling. And so when he walked onto that stage under the glow of studio lights, his confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was denial. He didn't realize the performer that had protected him for years was finally about to collapse. Because this time, his opponent wasn't there to argue. She was there to reveal. The voiceover slows, almost elegiac. Stephen Miller built his career on walls, real and imagined, but every wall, no matter how tall, eventually cast a shadow. And in that shadow stood the woman who would undo him. The camera zooms in on Miller's face from the debate, the moment the smirk fades, the moment control slips. Then fade to black. Before the lights, before the viral moments, Jasmine Crockett was the woman who refused to disappear. Her story doesn't begin in a studio or a marble hallway. It begins in the hum of a working-class Texas neighborhood where justice wasn't an idea, it was a fight fought daily on the front porch. Her mother taught her to speak truth even when it trembled. Her father taught her that silence in the face of cruelty was its own kind of violence. The Crockett household wasn't filled with wealth, but it overflowed with purpose. There were nights when bills were late, but lessons were never missed. Stand tall, her mother would say, not for applause, but for the ones who can't. In school, Jasmine learned early that being smart wasn't enough. It had to be undeniable. Teachers called her defiant. She called it survival. While others memorized rules, she memorized patterns of power. Who spoke first, who was ignored, who rewrote the truth while others stayed quiet. She decided she'd never stay quiet. Law school refined that defiance into discipline. While classmates chased prestige, she chased impact. Her first internship was in a public defender's office, where the waiting room was always full and the justice system always late. She saw mothers break down after losing custody because they couldn't afford a better attorney. She saw teenagers plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because freedom was too expensive. Every case hardened her conviction. The law could serve the people, but only if the people had someone willing to fight for them. She became that fighter. Her first major case was a civil rights lawsuit, an ordinary man beaten during a traffic stop. The defense painted him as angry, uncooperative, less than credible. Jasmine didn't just argue facts, she told his story. Every word carried the weight of generations silenced by the same script. When the verdict came back in his favor, she didn't celebrate. She just exhaled. That's one. Thousands more to go. She ran for office not because she sought power, but because she was tired of begging it to listen. Her campaign was small, local, grassroots. No corporate sponsors, no glossy billboards, just conviction and a borrowed microphone. She knocked on doors until her knuckles bruised, stood on porches where people said politics didn't matter, and convinced them it did. "I'm not here to be liked," she'd say. "I'm here to make you heard." When she entered Congress, the room felt colder. The looks lasted longer. She wasn't supposed to sit at those tables, wasn't supposed to challenge those norms. But she didn't shrink. She carried her Texas grit into every hearing, every headline, every confrontation where civility was used as a shield for cowardice. And yet, behind the calm fire, she carried weight. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be told to tone it down, to see the smirks that said, "You don't belong here." She also knew how to turn those moments into power. Every insult was kindling. Every dismissal was proof she was on the right path. When producers invited her to the televised debate with Stephen Miller, her advisors hesitated. "He's ruthless," one warned. "He'll twist everything." Jasmine smiled. "Let him," she said. "Truth doesn't need permission." In the days before the debate, she studied, not his policies, but his patterns. She watched interviews, read his essays, listened to his cadence. She learned his rhythm the way a musician studies dissonance. She knew he'd try to provoke her, to make her anger the story. So she planned something rarer: grace under attack. On the morning of a debate, she stood alone in her dressing room. The mirror reflected not vanity, but resolve. She thought of her mother's voice, the one that steadied her heartbeat before every storm. "You don't have to shout, baby. Just stand tall enough that the truth can find you." When she walked out onto that stage, she wasn't just a politician. She was the sum of every courtroom plea, every protest chant, every quiet prayer for fairness. Her presence was an answer to generations of exclusion. Her composure, an inheritance of every woman told to sit down. And so, when Stephen Miller smirked and tried to drown her with derision, Jasmine didn't flinch. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was strategy. She let him reveal himself before she revealed the truth. That's why, when her words finally came, measured, fierce, unshaken, they didn't just silence a man, they echoed through a country desperate for moral clarity. The voiceover softens, almost reverent. She didn't come to win an argument. She came to remind America what it's supposed to sound like when dignity speaks. The music rises, a quiet crescendo of strings and heartbeat. But if the opening clash was powerful, the storm that followed would test her composure and his legacy like never before. The debate resumes after a brief commercial break, but the air feels different now. Stephen Miller leans back in his chair, rehearsing his smile in the reflection of his water glass. Jasmine Crockett sits still, pen in hand, eyes forward, unmoved. The moderator's voice trembles slightly as he reads the next topic: national identity and who defines it. Miller strikes first. "Congresswoman Crockett," he begins, "you talk about compassion as though it's a policy. But leadership isn't about feelings. It's about protecting Americans, our culture, our values, from being diluted by unchecked migration. His voice is smooth again, rehearsed, confident. Crockett doesn't blink. Protecting Americans, she repeats. The words quiet, deliberate. All Americans, Mr. Miller, even the ones your definition of patriotism tries to erase. The audience murmurs. Miller chuckles, feigning patience. See, this is what I mean, he says, gesturing broadly. You turn security into sentiment. You can't run a nation on emotion. Her pen drops to the desk with a soft tap. You can't run it on cruelty either, she replies. The studio falls silent, the kind of silence that hums with tension. He pushes forward, irritation seeping through the practiced calm. Cruelty, he repeats. What's cruel about enforcing laws, about expecting people to respect our borders? She tilts her head slightly. It's cruel, she says, when law becomes an excuse to forget humanity. When children sleep under foil blankets because policy values punishment over mercy. When someone like you decides who gets to dream. For a split second, something flashes across Miller's face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. But it's gone before the camera catches it. He pivots, speaking faster now. You're turning a debate into a therapy session. You're pandering to emotions because you don't have facts. Crockett's reply is calm, surgical. The facts, she says, are written on the faces of people you'd rather not see. The moderator glances between them, sensing the voltage building in the room. The debate has stopped being about policy. It's a moral duel now. Every sentence is a test of composure, every breath a contest of conviction. Miller interrupts again, voice rising. You sound like someone ashamed of her own country. That's when she looks directly at him, for the first time since the opening exchange. No, she says softly. I love this country enough to tell it the truth. Crockett doesn't blink. Protecting Americans, she repeats. The words quiet, deliberate. All Americans, Mr. Miller, even the ones your definition of patriotism tries to erase. The audience murmurs. Miller chuckles, feigning patience. See, this is what I mean, he says, gesturing broadly. You turn security into sentiment. You can't run a nation on emotion. Her pen drops to the desk with a soft tap. You can't run it on cruelty either, she replies. The studio falls silent, the kind of silence that hums with tension. He pushes forward, irritation seeping through the practiced calm. Cruelty, he repeats. What's cruel about enforcing laws, about expecting people to respect our borders? She tilts her head slightly. It's cruel, she says, when law becomes an excuse to forget humanity. When children sleep under foil blankets because policy values punishment over mercy. When someone like you decides who gets to dream. For a split second, something flashes across Miller's face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. But it's gone before the camera catches it. He pivots, speaking faster now. You're turning a debate into a therapy session. You're pandering to emotions because you don't have facts. Crockett's reply is calm, surgical. The facts, she says, are written on the faces of people you'd rather not see. The moderator glances between them, sensing the voltage building in the room. The debate has stopped being about policy. It's a moral duel now. Every sentence is a test of composure, every breath a contest of conviction. Miller interrupts again, voice rising. You sound like someone ashamed of her own country. That's when she looks directly at him, for the first time since the opening exchange. No, she says softly. I love this country enough to tell it the truth. The audience erupts, not with applause, but with the low, rolling sound of disbelief and admiration. Even the moderator can't hide his awe. Miller smirks, but it's forced. Love, he sneers. Love doesn't mean letting the world walk all over you. She shakes her head. Love means not walking over anyone. He tries to cut her off again, but she raises her hand slightly, not in anger, but in control. You built your career on the idea that fear makes us strong, she continues. But fear doesn't protect, it corrodes. It turns neighbors into strangers, turns patriotism into paranoia. And you've sold that poison as policy for too long. The camera zooms in. His expression tightens. He's no longer debating, he's defending himself. Every retort lands heavier, more desperate. She, meanwhile, grows steadier, her words blooming with purpose. The tension breaks when the moderator interjects. We'll move to closing remarks. But Crockett isn't finished. Not yet, she says quietly, her eyes locked on Miller's. You asked who defines America. I'll tell you. Not the loudest voice, not the cruelest policy, but the people who keep building even when others try to burn it down. There's no applause this time, just silence. A silence so charged it feels like truth made visible. Miller leans forward, but for the first time all night, he doesn't speak. He can't. The moderator clears his throat, awkwardly signaling for a break. As the lights dim, the camera lingers on Jasmine Crockett, her face serene but fierce. Because what comes next isn't just a debate. It's the reckoning that will define them both. The final segment begins. The moderator's voice trembles as he announces, "We now move to closing statements." The air is thick, almost metallic. Stephen Miller straightens his tie, flashing the same smug half-smile that has carried him through every controversy of his career. He believes the worst is over, that he has survived her jabs, that the headlines tomorrow will still belong to him. He leans into the microphone. At the end of the day, he begins, this isn't about emotion or posturing. It's about protecting the American dream from those who would exploit it. I respect the Congresswoman's passion, but passion doesn't secure borders. It doesn't preserve sovereignty. Without rules, without control, you don't have a country, you have chaos. His words sound rehearsed, as though he's reciting a creed he's whispered to himself for years. The crowd is polite but uneasy. They've heard this speech before, dressed in different suits on different stages. It's the same justification that built detention centers and tore families apart. Then it's Jasmine Crockett's turn. She takes a breath. Not a nervous breath, a centering one, the kind a soldier takes before stepping into history. "Mr. Miller," she begins, voice steady as steel wrapped in silk. "You talk about control as if it's a virtue, but what you call control has always meant domination. What you call protection has always meant exclusion. You built an ideology that confuses cruelty with strength." A low murmur ripples through the crowd. Miller tries to cut in, but the moderator raises a hand. This is her time. "You say you want to protect the American dream, but you spent your career deciding who's allowed to have one." She leans forward, locking eyes with him. "The American dream was never meant to be gated property. It's supposed to be a promise that every child, every family, every soul who contributes to this country belongs here. You've turned that promise into a weapon." The crowd shifts in their seats. Phones rise like stars, recording, streaming, capturing every syllable. Miller scoffs, an unsteady laugh. "That's very poetic, Congresswoman, but you're describing a fantasy. Borders aren't hate, they're necessity." She doesn't flinch. "Necessity doesn't justify dehumanization," she says. "And what you've sold as security has always been fear in disguise. You've convinced good people to believe that compassion is weakness, that decency is dangerous. But you can't lead a free country by keeping people afraid of freedom." The audience breaks into applause, but she holds up her hand gently, quieting them. Her tone softens, not for him, but for everyone watching at home. "My grandmother used to say, fear will make a fool out of anyone who listens too long. You've built an empire on that fear, Mr. Miller. You've convinced people to lock the doors to their own humanity. But here's what I know." She pauses, and the silence stretches, pulling every heartbeat in the room toward her next sentence. "The people you demonize built this country. Immigrants built your railroads, fought in your wars, cleaned your offices, cared for your children, harvested your food, and still believed in the American dream, even when America forgot them. That's not weakness, that's devotion." For a moment, Miller has no words. His mouth opens, but nothing comes out. His smirk is gone. His eyes flicker toward the moderator, toward the cameras, toward the floor. Crockett doesn't press. She lets the silence do the work. It's heavier than any argument. Then she speaks again, lower now, almost intimate. "You can scare people for a while. You can lie to them about who their neighbors are. But eventually, truth gets tired of waiting." The camera zooms closer. Her expression is calm, but her words crackle with moral electricity. She says, "You once said you wanted to make America great again. But greatness doesn't come from who we shut out. It comes from how wide we open our arms." Applause erupts again, longer this time. Some in the audience stand. The moderator glances toward the control booth, unsure whether to cut for a commercial or let it ride. The producers wave frantically. "Don't cut! Let it roll!" Miller shifts in his chair, visibly rattled. "This is the problem," he says quickly. "You turn every debate into a sermon." She looks at him evenly. "No," she replies. "You turn every policy into a punishment. I'm just reminding people what mercy sounds like." The crowd gasps. Even the moderator's mouth opens slightly. Miller's face reddens. He grips the edges of his chair. He tries to pivot again, but the rhythm has changed. The show is hers now. She straightens, her voice rising, not with volume, but with conviction. History won't remember who shouted loudest, she says. It'll remember who stood firmest when truth was on trial. The words hang in the air. Every camera light burns brighter. Her closing lines arrive like a verdict. Mr. Miller, you built a career out of dividing America into us and them. But here's the truth you can't erase. There is no them. There's only us. And no wall, no policy, no propaganda will ever change that. For several seconds, the studio is motionless. Then, as on cue, applause crashes like a wave. The moderator lowers his cue cards. Even the camera operators can't help but nod. Miller looks down, avoiding her gaze. For the first time, he seems small. Crockett offers a quiet nod, not of triumph, but of peace. She doesn't need to gloat. She's already won the only battle that mattered, the one for the audience's conscience. The moderator, voice barely steady, says, "That concludes tonight's debate." But the debate isn't over. Not really. Because while Miller sits frozen in the heat of the moment, Crockett's words begin to echo far beyond the studio. Social media floods with clips before the credits even roll. Hashtags multiply, reaction videos appear within minutes. Her face, calm, commanding, compassionate, becomes the image of resistance redefined. And as Miller gathers his papers, forcing a tight smile, Crockett looks directly into the camera, the way only someone fearless can. America's not perfect, she says softly, but it's worth defending with truth. The feed cuts. Silence follows. And then, everywhere, uproar. Because in one night, one voice turned fear into its own undoing. The debate ends, but the echo doesn't. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop moment floods every platform. The internet catches fire. On X, her final line, "There is no them, there's only us," is trending in 5 languages. Instagram Reels remix her words over gospel choirs, protest marches, and immigrant family videos. TikTok turns it into an anthem. Across living rooms, phones, and newsrooms, America stops scrolling and starts listening. Cable networks scramble to spend the night. Right-wing pundits call it a display of emotional manipulation. One sneers, "She cried her way through a policy debate." But even their voices sound strained, defensive, brittle. Because the footage is undeniable. Her calm against his chaos. Her truth against his sneer. In progressive circles, it's more than a moment. It's a movement spark. Activists start stitching her words into signs. Latino, Black, and immigrant communities flood comment sections with crying face emojis and fists. One tweet reads, "She didn't just debate him, she baptized him in truth." Another says, "Jasmine Crockett didn't bring a mic, she brought a mirror." Meanwhile, Stephen Miller's camp panics. His aides try to bury the trending hashtags, release edited clips that strip away context, but nothing sticks. The raw, uncut version is everywhere, millions of views and counting. Miller's polished talking points have turned to dust against a single unscripted moment of moral clarity. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists are furious. "He underestimated her," one whispers to a journalist. "He thought he was debating a freshman. Turns out, he was debating the future." Jasmine, meanwhile, doesn't celebrate. She returns home past midnight, exhausted but still charged with purpose. The hum of her phone never stops, notifications stacking like applause. Aides tell her to rest. She doesn't. She scrolls through messages from immigrants, teachers, single moms, veterans, all thanking her for saying what they'd been too afraid to. One message freezes her hand mid-scroll. "My father was deported under Miller's policies. I thought America forgot about people like us. Tonight, you made me believe again." She exhales deeply. That's why she did it. Not for the headlines, but for this. The next morning, cable shows split-screen the debate. Miller's face hard, defensive, Jasmine's gaze unwavering. Commentators say she redefined what leadership looks like. One anchor says, "In an era of noise, she spoke in truth." Miller, by contrast, vanishes for a week. His appearances are quietly canceled. Anonymous insiders leak that he's furious about the optics. A close aide says he's angry that she got under his skin. He thought he was untouchable. But Crockett's rise doesn't slow. Invitations pour in, from universities, from late-night hosts, from grassroots organizations. Her words are quoted at rallies. Murals of her face start appearing in immigrant neighborhoods. Bold eyes, raised chin, the words, "There's only us," painted like prophecy. Still, Jasmine knows what fame can do. It can lift or it can distract. So she stays grounded, focused. In a quiet moment, she tells a reporter, "This isn't about me winning a debate. It's about the people who've been losing their humanity in silence for years." Her authenticity only magnifies her impact. Then, inevitably, the backlash comes. Miller's allies launch attack ads. Dark money groups release doctored clips, twisting her empathy into weakness. They flood conservative media with claims that she's anti-American, that she hates borders. But the attacks don't land like they used to. The narrative has shifted. People have seen too much of the real her. The attempt to smear her only amplifies the contrast, his cruelty against her conviction. In one televised panel, a conservative commentator says, "Miller was right about one thing. Without control, you don't have a country." A liberal guest cuts in, fire in her voice. "Without compassion, you don't have a soul." The crowd erupts. By week's end, polls show a surge in public trust for leaders who speak with moral conviction. Commentators start calling it the Crockett effect. Even those who don't agree with her policies can't deny her presence. There's something magnetic about someone who doesn't dodge truth, who wears her integrity like armor. One viral post sums it up best. Miller built fear like a fortress. Jasmine turned it into a window. Meanwhile, Miller's world contracts. Former allies distance themselves. Invitations dry up. He lashes out in interviews, accusing the media of bias, but every word only digs him deeper. He once thought he could control the narrative. Now he's trapped inside it. And still, Jasmine keeps moving, city to city, podium to podium. In every speech, she returns to the same core message, that democracy isn't about power, it's about empathy with purpose. That strength isn't domination, but defiance in service of hope. At one rally, standing under a sea of raised flags, she says, "America doesn't fall because it bends. It falls when it forgets why it stands." The crowd roars. The chant begins again. "There's only us," rolling across streets like thunder. In that sound is something Miller never understood: belonging. For years, he'd mastered fear, weaponized difference. But Crockett turned that script inside out, showing millions that compassion isn't a weakness, it's rebellion in its purest form. And though he still appears on talk shows and podcasts, his words no longer strike like before. They echo into diminishing applause. His power, once built on division, now feels obsolete, like an old song no one wants to hear anymore. Jasmine Crockett's name, on the other hand, has become shorthand for moral courage. When a journalist asks her how it feels to be called the voice of America's conscience, she smiles slightly. "I'm not the voice. I'm just the echo. The voice belongs to the people who refuse to stay silent." That humility, real, grounded, unperformed, cements her legacy beyond politics. As the credits roll on the week's news cycle, one montage closes with her face, lit by stage lights, eyes clear, voice unshaken. You can't outshout truth. You can only delay its arrival, but it always finds a way through. Weeks later, the firestorm begins to calm, but the impact doesn't fade. It deepens. The debate that started as a televised clash has evolved into something larger, something moral. Across campuses, cafes, and community centers, people aren't talking about who won the argument. They're talking about what it meant. And that's where Jasmine Crockett stands now. Not on a stage, but in a story that's bigger than herself. She's invited to speak at a town hall in El Paso. The room is full. Parents, students, veterans, dreamers. Some are crying before she even begins. The mural of her from Dallas is projected behind her. "There's only us." She takes the podium quietly, without pretense. The applause rises like a wave, but she doesn't rush to speak. She lets the silence breathe. Then softly, she begins. "You know, when I stood across from Stephen Miller, I wasn't thinking about politics. I was thinking about my grandmother, the woman who taught me that dignity isn't given by titles or borders. It's earned in how we treat each other when no one's watching." The room falls utterly still. Her voice carries that warmth that can pierce even cynicism. He thought this debate was about who deserves to belong, but what I learned is belonging isn't permission, it's truth. It's already ours. She tells them about the messages she received. The father separated from his children, the student mocked for her accent, the woman fired for wearing her hijab. They all wrote the same thing, Jasmine says. They said, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not invisible." A tear glints in her eye, but she doesn't falter. That's the America I fight for. One that doesn't make people prove their humanity just to exist in peace. As she speaks, the crowd starts nodding, standing, clapping through their tears. Then her tone hardens. Not angry, but resolute. We've seen what happens when fear becomes law, when cruelty gets dressed up as patriotism, when the people who preach about strength are the first to weaponize weakness. She pauses, then smiles faintly. But what Stephen Miller didn't understand that night is this: cruelty always burns itself out because it has no roots. But dignity grows in the ashes. That line lands like thunder. People are on their feet, roaring approval. Cameras flash, but Jasmine looks past them, to the faces, the stories, the pain turned into power. When the applause fades, she ends not with triumph, but reflection. America's greatness doesn't come from who shouts the loudest, she says. It comes from who listens the deepest, from who reaches out a hand even when it's easier to point a finger. Then she looks straight into the crowd, and by extension, the audience watching from home. So if you're tired of being told you don't belong, remember this: you already do. You're not guests in this country, you're the builders of it. You're not the problem, you're the promise. The words hang there, electric and alive. People are crying. Some are holding their phones up, streaming live. Others just stand silently, hands over their hearts. As she steps back from the microphone, the chant begins again. Quiet at first. There's only us. There's only us. Spreading through the hall until it's a thunderous rhythm of unity. And that's when you realize this isn't just a political speech. It's a reclamation of identity, a rewriting of what it means to belong in America. The camera pans over faces, a Latina mother holding her child, a Black veteran saluting, a white farmer nodding in tears. Different lives, same heartbeat. Jasmine looks out at them all, her people, her country, and whispers almost to herself, "We're still here." And that's everything. But before the screen cuts completely, the narrator's voice returns, low and resonant. In a time when truth is treated like noise, one voice can still rise above the static, not to divide, but to remind us who we are. The screen fades in from black, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. The sound of distant applause lingers like an echo from a memory. Then Jasmine Crockett's voice, calm but commanding, fills the silence. America is more than a headline. It's more than the people who want to make us afraid of each other. It's every hand that still believes in building something better, together. Clips roll across the screen, her shaking hands with a border nurse, a teacher leading immigrant kids in the Pledge of Allegiance, a young voter walking into a polling booth for the first time. Each image bleeds into the next, struggle into strength, pain into purpose. Her narration continues. If you felt something when you watched that debate, if you saw a reflection of your own fight, don't let it end here. Speak up. Stand with those who can't. Share the truth louder than they share their hate. The tone swells, cinematic strings rising like dawn breaking through storm clouds. Because the story of America isn't written by fear. It's written by people who refuse to give up on each other. There's only us. Then her voice again, softer, almost intimate. If you believe in dignity over division, if you believe we still have the power to write the next chapter together, don't just watch, be part of it. Subscribe, share this story, tell yours. Because movements don't start with millions. They start with one, and tonight, maybe that one is you. Music fades out. The final shot lingers on Jasmine, half-lit, resolute, the look of someone who has seen the storm and chosen to stand in the light.